All right, what we want to do today, we want to take a look at some of the historical policies of our past United States presidents. And this is not just like a history lesson, but we're trying to find examples of when the presidents have used specific presidential powers and find examples of when presidents have done things that have expanded the power of the president. So here we have our most recent living ex-presidents. We have from the left, the 41st President George Herbert Walker Bush, then the 44th President Barack Obama, the 43rd President George W. Bush, 42nd President Bill Clinton, and the 39th President Jimmy Carter on the far right there. So these are just some of the presidents that we will explore their policies and actions from when they were in office. We're going to look at domestic and foreign policy accomplishments. All right, what we want to do today, our objective, we want to describe the achievements of former presidents. We're going to look at their domestic policy achievements and their foreign policy achievements. We want to be able to explain their achievements and how they have contributed to the growth of presidential powers. So just like in our previous set of things to explore, we are trying to figure out how presidential powers have expanded over time. Only now we're looking at concrete examples of this happening. We are not going to worry about every president. We're going to start with Dwight Eisenhower here. He's going to be one of our modern presidents. When we're talking about modern presidents, we are mostly talking about presidents that were in charge during or after the Cold War, because this is really when the president's national security powers are really expanding a great deal. So Eisenhower, the first of these that we're going to take a look at, he is a Republican elected in 1952. He was the general of the armies in World War II, so he was more of a national hero than a political figure. He was actually recruited by both parties. But let's take a look at his domestic and foreign policy achievements. In domestic policy here, Eisenhower has one of the most important examples that we will use. This is where Eisenhower used the federal troops to desegregate schools in the South. So as he used his commander-in-chief powers in a new way, he actually used the army against the governments of some states to enforce federal law, in this case, Supreme Court decisions. So first, notably sending the troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to desegregate Little Rock Central High School. So this is a big expansion of the commander-in-chief power for the president. We see the president using the troops in a new way, and we see the president using the troops to make sure that federal law is enforced in the states. So this would be a great example we could use for how federal power has expanded. Other big domestic policy achievements of Eisenhower include the creation of the interstate highway system. This is something that he accomplished with Congress. So this is Congress using their power. This is an implied power that comes with the post office. They have to establish a post office and post roads. So here, Eisenhower and Congress worked together to create the interstate highway system to better connect the cities of the United States. Also, Eisenhower responsible for the creation of NASA. So similarly, working with Congress, he asked Congress to create a government agency whose role will be to explore space. So this is part of a Cold War expansion of the government's role, but they create a federal agency whose job is to do scientific research. So a little bit of a promote the arts and sciences power of Congress there. Foreign policy-wise, this is why we would, one of the reasons we have Eisenhower as one of our first modern presidents here is Eisenhower is going to be the first president that we associate with what we call a doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine. When we say that there's a president has a doctrine of foreign policy, this is their philosophy of foreign policy. So the Eisenhower Doctrine was a policy of containing the spread of communism. Communism, in order to be successful, would need to spread to many governments around the world. And so the philosophy of the Eisenhower government was to prevent the spread of communism anywhere they could. So the big time this is happening in the Eisenhower administration is the Korean War, a war where the United States is allied with South Korea. They fight against communist North Korea to prevent the spread of communism there in a Korean Civil War. But another important thing Eisenhower does here is he starts using the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, basically using his commander-in-chief power to order the CIA to intervene and help overthrow governments in both Iran and Guatemala. So the role of the United States is really expanding under Eisenhower, as he is not just handling things here in America, but is getting the United States way more heavily involved in different countries around the world. All right, after Eisenhower, moving into the 60s, in the election of 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected. Kennedy, of course, assassinated while president, so he does not finish a whole term in office, but we will take a look at a couple of the policy achievements of Kennedy here. There's really not going to be a ton of policy achievements for John F. Kennedy. He is definitely a popular president and did a great job, with the bully pulpit and getting the support of the public, but not a ton of policy achievements here to associate with him. We will see him continue Eisenhower's policy of using the troops to implement desegregation orders from the courts. He does create the Apollo program. This is a mission for NASA, so he basically gives the government the goal of landing men on the moon by the end of the decade, which they do accomplish. Using the old FDR idea of the New Deal, he creates a program called the New Frontier, which is just a name for a program that was easy to promote. So this is kind of a use of a bully pulpit here to get the public on your side. But this was a program that included a lot of social welfare program expansions. And Kennedy also led the push for the 24th Amendment. So he's helping to propose a law to Congress that would eliminate the poll tax if it were added to the Constitution, which ultimately happened later after he died. Foreign policy-wise, there are a few things here to think about. First, he created the Peace Corps program, which you may have heard of. There's a program that we still have today. A lot of college graduates join the Peace Corps. They send young U.S. graduates fresh out of college around the world to kind of serve as ambassadors in a lot of underdeveloped areas. And so this is a great outreach program that the United States uses to build good relationships with countries around the world. Kennedy's other stuff, not so great. Kennedy had a failed invasion of Cuba. This was a time where tensions between the United States and Cuba were very, very high. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you guys would have learned about in U.S. history class, where the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba. We almost ended up in a nuclear war there. Kennedy begins the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, sending military to South Vietnam in the same way that the United States defended South Korea against North Korea. The United States got involved in the Vietnamese Civil War to try to prevent the spread of communism there. This is also the beginning of the military alliance between the United States and the Israeli military. So the United States becoming a lot more involved in the issues in the Middle East in terms of foreign policy. So just like under Eisenhower, under Kennedy, the United States' role in the world is expanding. The United States is getting involved in foreign policy, getting involved in a lot of other different places around the world. After Kennedy was killed, his vice president took over. So next we have Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is going to be one of our most successful presidents policy-wise. When he was serving in Congress as a representative, he made it to be the Speaker of the House. So he was the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. Then he moved on and won a Senate seat for Texas. So he was in the U.S. Senate and he became the Senate Majority Leader. So he led the House and later he led the Senate. He had the most important lawmaking experience that you could have. And so he is incredibly good at getting laws passed. Let's start with his domestic policy. His domestic policy achievements are some of the most impressive that we have for a president. Now, first, he would have expanded a lot of programs under what he called the Great Society. That's where he put his name on a package of programs so that he was better able to use the bully pulpit to sell this to the public. This included expansion of social welfare programs, including things like food stamps, including things like healthcare for people that couldn't afford it, all sorts of different ways to help out people that couldn't afford housing and all this kind of stuff. One of the biggest changes to the government took place under Lyndon Johnson, and that would be the creation of the Medicare program. So here, he was able to get Medicare passed. Now, Medicare gives health insurance to all adults over the age of 65. So here, this is a huge change in policy for the government, because what he does is he turns the United States government into an insurance company. The United States now is a provider of health insurance services for all Americans over the age of 65, which makes it the biggest health insurance company that we have. Johnson was also able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a huge law that bans discrimination in any place that serves the public. And a year after that, passed the Voting Rights Act, which passed a ton of laws to help end racial discrimination in voting practices. This is a law that we will look at later when we're exploring voting rights, but this has a huge amount of increased powers for the national government to monitor and enforce non-discrimination laws in the southern states. LBJ is also responsible for passing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act, which started all of the programs that would, through the Department of Education, that would help people pay for college. So as you guys are filling out your FAFSAs and stuff, trying to get your financial aid for school, this would be the program that started all of those things. Foreign policy-wise, Lyndon Johnson not nearly as successful. Lyndon Johnson's main foreign policy thing that we would associate with him would be the Vietnam War. He's president for the bulk of the Vietnam War. And this is going to be the thing that ultimately makes him unpopular with the American public. It was found out late in the war that his administration was lying to the public about how successful the war was going and everything. He ended up not even running for a second term. Because he was becoming so unpopular because of how the Vietnam War was going. Now, his policy is kind of an escalation of the containment policy. His foreign policy is what we call the domino theory. This is where they felt like if one country fell to communism, then the countries nearby it would fall like a stack of dominoes. And so they were. This is why they were so invested in preventing the spread of communism into South Vietnam. They felt like if South Vietnam fell to communism, then all of its neighbors eventually would the same way. Now, this is the beginning of the Cold War period that we know as détente. This is where tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union started to cool off. And we can see this in the first SALT negotiations. This is what we call a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So we have the president negotiating a treaty to limit the arms production of the United States, as long as Russia promised to limit the arms production as well. So here, we see the president using his power to negotiate treaties. All right, that takes us from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson. That's taken us through the 50s and 60s. We will move on and deal with Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, dealing with the presidents of the 70s and 80s.